All right, this is part three of my take on Kyle Rittenhouse's filing of a countersuit against Gaige Grosskreutz. In this video, we're going to look at each of the responses that Kyle has offered to the claims made by Gaige Grosskreutz in his lawsuit. So stay tuned. Hello out there. I am trying to get through.
With his powerful brainwaves cradled in the warmth of reasoning, it's time for Johnny Walker Dread to straighten you out on a thing or two. Emanating all the way from exciting Las Vegas, Oklahoma, it's the Johnny Walker Dread Show.
I misspoke in my earlier video. I said that Kyle's suit was amended to the original lawsuit of Kimberly Motley, and that, of course, is false. This is actually his own document, his responses to her claims, and I don't know if this is available online or not without being paying for it. Kyle sent this to me, so thanks, Kyle. I appreciate it. Let's go ahead and read Kyle's responses to Gaige Grosskreutz's claims. Okay, so the numbered statements refers to claims made by Gaige Grosskreutz or Kimberly Motley, or stolen from the previous lawsuit filed by Anthony Huber's dad. As I have mentioned before, Kimberly Motley's just simply copied that lawsuit into her own and even made mistakes in not correcting certain things that made it obvious that she had simply copied and pasted from somebody else's document. Now, plagiarism doesn't have a real role here. Lawyers are not trying to claim any kind of intellectual property from their lawsuits, so that's not much of an issue. Lawyers pilfer each other's lawsuits all the time, probably because lazy. Okay, so let's go ahead and read this. We appreciate you guys. We really do. Okay, and so that was the claim made by Gaige Grosskreutz, and here is Kyle's response. Defendant Rittenhouse asserts that the statement contained in this paragraph fails to provide sufficient information to form the basis of an allegation to which Defendant Rittenhouse may reasonably provide a response. Let me paraphrase that for you. So what? That's what he's saying. We appreciate you guys. We really do. Yeah. So what about it? Okay. And Kyle's lawyers are going to make this kind of statement throughout this. I'm not going to keep repeating them. Okay. It'll take forever. And it goes on. These were the words of Kenosha law enforcement officers, words of encouragement and thanks given to Kyle Rittenhouse and his band of white nationalist vigilantes on the evening of August 25th, 2020. And Kyle responds, Defendant Rittenhouse denies that he is a white nationalist vigilante. Defendant Rittenhouse further denies being part of any band of white nationalist vigilantes on the evening of August 25th. And it goes on, Defendant Rittenhouse lacks sufficient information. As I said, they're going to keep repeating that over and over again. And I'll skip down. They're talking about Jacob Blake here. So I won't even tell you what Gaige wrote here, but the response is rather interesting. Defendant Rittenhouse denies, 1, having patrolled the streets of Kenosha acting as a law enforcement agent. And again, as I mentioned when I first read Gaige Grosskreutz's lawsuit the first time, they made a tremendous mistake in trying to form the allegation that in alleging that Kyle Rittenhouse was acting as a peace officer. He was not. He was not deputized or anything like that. Number 2, having personally posted any racist messages on social media related to the civil unrest in Kenosha. They're coming out and saying he's never posted anything racist whatsoever. 3, having personally threatened violence on social media related to civil unrest in Kenosha. Okay. And 4, making any plans to go to Kenosha known to law enforcement. So again, Gaige Grosskreutz's original lawsuit is all about a conspiracy. He's claiming that there was a conspiracy between Kyle and law enforcement to deny him his rights. And so number 4 is, I did not tell the police I was going to be in Kenosha. They did not know I was going to be there. And later he's going to claim that they never did find out he was there until after the shootings. Defendant Rittenhouse affirmatively admits that he was compliant within the laws of the state of Wisconsin under Wisconsin Statute 948.60. We all know what that is. That is the minor in possession charge, right? While carrying the firearm at issue. Defendant Rittenhouse affirmatively admits that the firearm at issue was purchased in the state of Wisconsin and did not leave the state of Wisconsin after it was legally purchased by Dominic Black. Defendant Rittenhouse denies the remaining allegations contained within this paragraph. Okay. So Gaige is claiming,
instead, the law enforcement defendants deputized these armed individuals conspired with them and ratified their actions by letting them patrol the streets, armed with deadly weapons to mete out justice as they saw fit.
and of course this is absurd. None of the guards there that night were deputized, and I went through that in my previous video where I read Gaige's lawsuit. That's a ridiculous claim, and I don't understand how any rational person could put something like that in a lawsuit. But then we're talking about Kimberly Motley here.
I was the only one brave enough to make that idiotic statement. That's why.
But I shouldn't be too harsh on her. She stole that from the other lawsuit. So the dingbats that wrote the lawsuit on behalf of Anthony Huber's dad, they're the idiots that first put that in there. Defendant Rittenhouse admits having received water directly from law enforcement on August 25th. Defendant Rittenhouse, however, denies being deputized by any member of law enforcement, conspiring with any member of law enforcement, patrolling the streets of Kenosha, meting out any type of justice, and having participated in any plan by law enforcement to deal with any other individuals present in Kenosha. And that was the infamous claim that Ryan Balch made, that the cops were just going to push the protesters into Kyle's area. We don't know for sure if that claim is valid or not. Ryan Balch claimed that a police officer told him that. Frankly, I believe him. But I also don't believe that the officer was actually speaking on behalf of the police force. It was just probably some offhand statement made. And so I don't think there's anything to it. I certainly don't think that the Kenosha Police Department had a plan to push the protesters and let the guards deal with them. I think that was, again, just somebody on the force shooting their mouth off.
As a result, Defendant Rittenhouse fired his assault rifle indiscriminately multiple times at citizens on the street.
And of course, Defendant Rittenhouse denies firing his rifle indiscriminately at any individual. Defendant Rittenhouse affirmatively admits lawfully firing 4 shots at Joseph Rosenbaum as an act of self-defense, and he admits firing 1 shot at Anthony Huber, 2 shots at a masked, unidentified individual known as Jump Kick Man, although I don't think that... Was Jump Kick Man masked? I guess he was, that's right. Defendant Rittenhouse affirmatively admits to successfully, get this, disarming Gaige Grosskreutz. With 1 shot from his firearm as an act of self-defense.
Mr. Grosskreutz tried to end Defendant Rittenhouse's homicidal rampage.
Come on. Again, I think this came from the original lawsuit filed by Anthony Huber, or John Huber. Defendant Rittenhouse denies all allegations contained in this paragraph of the complaint. Defendant Rittenhouse specifically denies that any deaths attributed to him in this complaint were acts of homicide. Mark Richards, they were clearly acts of homicide. They just weren't acts of murder. And we all know the distinction, right? And Richards does too, of course, but for some reason he chose not to pick on that. But I would have. Defendant Rittenhouse admits, I'm going to quit saying affirmatively because it's hard. I really do struggle on that word. So Defendant Rittenhouse admits that all casualties or injuries resulting from the course of activity relevant to this complaint occurred as a result of his lawful exercise of his right to self-defense.
Defendant Rittenhouse had first killed.
So here's another claim.
Defendant Rittenhouse had first killed Joseph Rosenbaum, an individual who had confronted Defendant Rittenhouse wandering the streets, pointing a weapon of war at protesters.
That's right. She actually used that terminology. Defendant Rittenhouse admits lawfully firing 4 shots at Joseph Rosenbaum in an act of self-defense after Rosenbaum threatened Rittenhouse and chased him down. Defendant Rittenhouse admits that this lawful exercise of his right to self-defense ultimately resulted in the death of Mr. Rosenbaum.
Instead of rendering aid to Mr. Rosenbaum, defendant Rittenhouse fled.
In response, defendant Rittenhouse did not personally render aid to Mr. Rosenbaum. Defendant Rittenhouse denies that he fled after the shootings occurred. Well, I don't know, he kind of did. I mean, not to say that there was anything wrong with that. Defendant Rittenhouse admits leaving the scene of the Rosenbaum shooting in order to reach the law enforcement and surrender himself into their control. Again, I don't know. I mean, to me, it's like he fled because people were going to be descending on him. I don't see how that weakens his case, but okay.
When the protesters saw him fleeing, they called for him to stop. He kept running, pointing his AR-15 at protesters as he ran.
In response, defendant Rittenhouse denies that the individuals referenced were protesters. Okay? As all lawful protesting that occurred in Kenosha on August 25th had ended at the conclusion of daytime hours. So I guess they're invoking the curfew thing, I guess. I mean, who are they to say when protesting lawfully ends, other than if it's a curfew? Defendant Rittenhouse denies that the individuals referenced as protesters in this paragraph were calling for him to stop. Okay, that's true. None of them really were. I certainly did not hear anybody yelling at Kyle to stop, which is kind of a problem for Gaige Grosskreutz. Defendant Rittenhouse denies pointing his firearm at any protesters as he ran. That's true. We have that fully on video. He never did point his rifle at anyone as he ran. Defendant Rittenhouse admits that as he was running towards the police, the identified individuals simultaneously called out demands for his execution. That is, cranium that boy and truck him. I never have heard that mentioned before. That's a new one to me.
One protester, a black man who had watched defendant Rittenhouse kill Mr. Rosenbaum, chased Rittenhouse as an effort to protect others from the violence he had just watched at the hands of Rittenhouse.
Defendant Rittenhouse admits that Joseph Rosenbaum was not yet deceased at the time this individual began his pursuit of Rittenhouse. My big question is that who are they to claim that this man had watched defendant Rittenhouse kill Mr. Rosenbaum? They don't even know who he is. They haven't interviewed him, as far as I know. So who are they to claim that he saw it? Rather interesting, and something that Mark Richards doesn't really pick up on. This would have been a perfectly good time to bring in that whole, we have no way of responding to this because we don't have the information in front of us. But for some reason, Mark Richards doesn't put that in there, which is rather odd.
The individual,
we're talking about Jump Kick Man,
did not reach for defendant Rittenhouse. His hands were in his pocket.
And in response, defendant Rittenhouse denies the allegations.
Instead, he tried to kick Mr. Rosenbaum's weapon out of his hands.
Yeah, they're actually making that claim. Defendant Rittenhouse admits that this individual jump kicked him in the face after defendant Rittenhouse had already been knocked to the ground by other members of the violent mob chasing him.
Defendant Rittenhouse tried to kill this man without any possible basis for believing that his life was in danger.
Right. Give me a break. Even if you felt that Jump Kick Man was in the right for trying to stomp Kyle's face into the ground, there's no way in hell that you're going to be able to convince anybody that Kyle should not have seen that as dangerous. Indeed, it says, defendant Rittenhouse admits that he had reasonable fear of death or great bodily harm from this individual based upon the totality of the circumstances as they existed at the time. Defendant Rittenhouse admits sustaining a head injury as a result of the actions of this individual. So Kyle is making a claim that not only did Jump Kick Man tried to kick him in the head. He did, and he actually injured Kyle. That's rather interesting. I did not know that. I did not know that Kyle was making that claim.
Having seen this intent to kill with his own eyes, Anthony Huber tried to disarm defendant Rittenhouse.
Kyle admits that prior to this specific interaction, Anthony Huber had attempted to forcibly remove Kyle's head from his shoulders by swinging a skateboard at Kyle's head and neck area. Come on, Mark. Really? Separating his head from his shoulders? All right, I wouldn't have written it that way.
Mr. Huber had heard that Rittenhouse had already killed and watched him shoot at an unarmed person, so Mr. Huber clearly understood that this was a violent individual.
And my response would have been, dudes, I'm sorry, but you didn't interview Anthony Huber. You have no way of knowing what he was thinking whatsoever. Anthony Huber may well have realized that Kyle was not a violent person and simply wanted to rub him out for political reasons. How would you know otherwise? You didn't interview him. He never made any statements whatsoever to justify this claim of yours. And listen how Mark Richards responds. Kyle denies the allegations contained in this paragraph of the complaint. Kyle admits that Joseph Rosenbaum was not yet deceased at the time of Anthony Huber's interaction with defendant Rittenhouse. That's all you're going to say? The very fact that their claim rests on absolutely nothing is not even mentioned. I mean, okay, maybe this is the way lawyers talk, but I think I could have made a stronger argument. The fact is, nobody knows what Anthony Huber was thinking when he attacked Kyle. You can't even surmise it because you have no way of knowing what his mindset was, whether he was out to protect the public or whether he was out to inflict pain on a person he perceived as a political opponent. So we just get to make shit up? Okay, so I'm going to skip through some of the Gaige Grosskreutz thing, but keep in mind, the allegations made by Gaige Grosskreutz here, through his attorney, never claims that Gaige Grosskreutz was carried a pistol. That is rather interesting. And the reason why is very simple. Anthony Huber's lawyers didn't mention it. And the reason why they didn't mention it was because they were representing Anthony Huber, not Gaige Grosskreutz. To them, whether Gaige was carrying a pistol or not wasn't all that relevant. Okay? In this case here, Kimberly Motley is representing Gaige Grosskreutz. The fact that he was carrying a pistol is very relevant. In fact, it is probably the most relevant fact in this entire case. And because she copied her lawsuit directly from Huber's, she never put the gun in there. And this is why it's not always a good idea to just simply copy and paste somebody else's lawsuit for your own. So she left out a material fact, the most important material fact, completely ignored it. I have a feeling that's going to come back to bite her. It certainly is extraordinarily dishonest. But we're talking about Kimberly Motley here. Okay, he, talking about Grosskreutz,
approached with his hands in the air to try to ease the situation and stop the killing.
Never minding the fact that he had a pistol in one of his hands. We just don't mention that, do we? Defendant Rittenhouse admits that when Grosskreutz first approached Rittenhouse, as Rittenhouse lay on the ground, Grosskreutz had a drawn, loaded pistol in his right hand. It takes Kyle's attorney to mention this. Amazing. Kyle admits that after he turned to face Grosskreutz, Grosskreutz raised his hands in the air as in feigned surrender, but still retained active grip and control of his pistol. Kyle admits lowering his weapon upon seeing Grosskreutz's hands raised in such a manner. Kyle then admits that after he lowered his weapon, Grosskreutz ended his feint, raised his pistol, and pointed the pistol at Rittenhouse's head with the intent to shoot defendant Rittenhouse. Okay, that's much more accurate. And that leaves us with arguments about jurisdiction and venue pretty dry, so I'm going to go ahead and stop it here. We have one more video to cover. There's another section on facts that I want to cover, but you get the idea. Let me know what you think. Like my video and subscribe to my channel.